Superpowers, a superhuman ability devised to overcome adversity, lifting the oppressed and sharing a gift with the world. For years you've been told to hide your true self, to ignore your superpower deep inside. This power will often take the shape of a voice that tells you that you have more to offer than the life you're living. But what if there was a way to unleash this superpower? To pull back the covers that had kept it hidden in the shadows for too long? And how many lives could you change if you finally let it free? To help you on your gifted path, your next set of remarkable masters are waiting. A Hall of Fame speaker who supported over 1 million people all around the world to find their value and discover what makes them fascinating. And an award-winning author, host of one of the world's top podcasts, and pioneer in the personal development field, who's created an impact in over 150 countries, who will all help you answer the question, how do I unleash my superpower?
I first want to welcome you both and thank you both for hanging out with us. I feel like
awesome.
I feel like this conversation has been meant to happen for years. And let's kick off. And by the way, everyone joining live, welcome. So honored that you are all here with us from all over the world. So here's how I want to begin. I've been thinking a lot about the future. I kind of feel like I live in the future. And I feel like in 10 years, the world is going to be dramatically different with the progress of artificial intelligence and robotics and virtual reality and the metaverse and all kinds of new technology. I think the concept of work is going to be fundamentally different and changed. And for many people, this disruption will create crisis. And I think for all of us here and everyone listening and watching, it's the biggest opportunity ever. And in our conversation today, between the three of us, I want to help the audience answer three ginormous questions. The first one is, what are my superpowers? Or in other words, what is my greatest gift or contribution I can make to help other people? And then number two, what makes me different? And how can I use my difference to make a difference? And three, what should I do with my life that creates meaning, fulfillment, and joy? So I think all three of us are on a very similar journey with a similar mission, which is why I'm so excited to have this conversation today. So Sally, let's start with you. Your upcoming book is called Different is Better Than Better. So why is different better than better? And why are all of us so afraid of being different?
Gio, when you were growing up, did you ever feel like you were getting compared to other people and you came out on the losing end?
Very often.
Did you ever feel like there was some kind of a standard that you were trying to hit? Maybe it was grades, maybe it was a sports score, a certain number of friends, the way you looked, the way you dressed, the way you acted. Did you ever feel like there was some scorecard and nobody ever gave you the rules?
All the time.
Yeah, I felt the same way. And I think a lot of us, the problem is when we grow up in a culture of comparison and we feel like we're being plotted against somebody else, where somebody's going to be better and somebody's going to be worse. We growing up in a world where one person wins and everybody else isn't also ran. I grew up in a family in which when I was 7 years old, my sister won 3 gold medals in the Olympics, and my brother graduated from Harvard. So I grew up in a family in which there was no way I was going to be better than, but I knew that I could be different. So when we think about the world, when we approach the world from a place of seeing the way in which we don't have to compete one-on-one, every single one of us has something spectacular that's already innately in us. The problem is that we don't have a scorecard for that. So in the course of the last couple of years, I've been talking to hundreds of thousands of people about what are those qualities that weren't the ones that had them be the track star, the math star, that got them the promotion, but instead allowed them to do something astonishingly, extraordinarily different so that they could be heard and remembered out in the world. Gio, have you felt that way? Have you felt that way too? That sometimes you've got to improve your game instead of just doing your own thing?
Yeah, it's been a constant conflict of improvement versus distinction.
What about you, Jonathan? Did you ever feel like you were being measured in a way that you had to try to outdo somebody else?
No, never, not at all.
Well, you have had an
Let's just
impression.
say, let's just say my 6th grade nickname was Freaky Field. So I've always been a little bit different. There's never been sort of like a season of my life where I've sort of like just fallen easily into the conforming mainstream, for better and for worse at different moments. But yeah, for sure, I was always the person where the playbook didn't quite fit the way that my DNA was wired.
Speaking of playbooks, Jonathan, I'd love to introduce you and your most recent book. I'll hold it up here. Is called Sparked, and the subtitle is "Discover Your Unique Imprint for Work That Makes You Come Alive." And I'm very curious, what does "come alive" mean?
So I had to kind of go into that to really understand how to begin the research. And because I started asking myself, when I'm doing something, when I'm investing effort in a serious and sustained way, whether that's working for the thing that I get paid for, whether it's my primary role, my devotion, something I just, I can't not do because of the feeling it gives me. What is that feeling? And I'm somebody who likes to define things. I like to map things. I like to get specific and granular because I feel like there's way too much ambiguity in the world of business, in the world of personal development. So when I start to ask myself, what is that feeling that I have when I feel like the world is as it should be, even though I'm working really hard and maybe for a lot of hours, what's actually going on inside of me? So I started to deconstruct that term coming alive, because you see that phrase coming alive used in all different contexts, and everyone's going to define it differently, which honestly is completely fine. But if I'm going to actually develop an entire body of work that's going to take me years or decades, like similar to Sally has been so deep into her body of work, you want to understand what you're talking about. And even if people are using similar phrases differently, you want to make crystal clear, what do you mean when you use this phrase? So for me, that phrase coming alive deconstructs into 5 distinct elements. One of them is a sense of meaning, so that the thing that I'm doing gives me a sense that it matters. And maybe if I derive meaning from that I matter while I'm doing it. The second component is flow, access to that state where the world really isn't separate from us. We become absorbed in the activity, time fugues, and we enter that state that has been researched and identified as being hyper present, hyper generative, hyper creative, hyper cognizant. And it's a really, really powerful place to be. The third piece is energy and excitement. In the corporate world, the language wrapped around that is usually engagement. But I prefer to just speak normal speak.
Yes, please.
Even though all of us function often like in the world of large organizations, like I like to talk to individuals. Do you wake up in the morning feeling excited and energized about what you do, even if you know it's going to be really hard in a lot of hours? Like, does it give more to you than it takes? And do you still want to do it, even though you know what's awaiting you? The fourth component is what I call expressed potential. And to me, that is, Sally, you asked that really interesting question, and I'll pose another question, which is like, how many, whether Sally or whether Gio or like everyone listening to this, how many of you have been walking around having this sense that there's a potential out there that that you're capable of stepping into and expressing, and yet you can't close the gap? So you feel there's a sense of felt potential, and there's the sense of the way that you're actually moving through the world right now, and there's a gap between them, right? I call that the potential gap, and you can't quite identify what it is, and you have no idea how to close that gap. And so the fourth component for me is expressed potential. It's the ability to step into a work mode in a way that intrinsically closes that gap without you even trying, just because it is so fiercely aligned with the essence of who you are. The final element is purpose. And that deconstructs into two different levels. One is an immediate sense of purpose, like that feeling like you know what you're working towards. It's fairly well defined and you know why you're doing it. But then zoom the lens out to a more broad exploration, and it's a sense of purpose in life. You know, that feeling like I'm waking up and I'm doing the thing I was put here to do. And now that doesn't mean it's one thing. That may manifest as 1,000 different things, the same way like in Sally's work, like once you identify this deeper source code, right, it may show up in 1,000 different ways. But that deeper impulse is being mined in some way, shape, or form. So for me, when I use the phrase coming alive, if you think of a Venn diagram where it's the overlap of those 5 different states, that's the experience. That's the sort of cumulative state that I'm talking about when I use that phrase. And we've been really fortunate, you know, like what started as a hunch in the body of work around the Sparcotypes now is proving out in research that people say the more that they do work that is aligned with this deeper impulse, in fact, the more likely they are to say that they experience all 5 of those states on a much more persistent basis. And the side benefits of that are not only extraordinary in terms of work, but just in terms of life. I mean, you get to open your eyes in the morning and move through your days having this feeling. I mean, not that work is the only way that you can get any of these states. You know, you can derive meaning from love, you can derive meaning from sacrifice or suffering or loss. But we do spend so much of our lives doing this thing called work. So if we can derive those states from it, that's been a lot of my quest. Like, how do we get there? So when I use that phrase, those are the 5 components that I'm really talking about.
I love that. And I love knowing that the two of you have invested decades into your bodies of work. And I want to jump back to Sally in terms of the past few decades. You've helped millions of people uncover what makes them unique and different through the concept of fascination. Can you explain what you mean by the word fascinating?
Sure. Fascination is the brain's most intense state of focus. And when you're totally fascinated by somebody, you are listening and hearing and remembering them. And you know this feeling, you know, when you're in a meeting and your words are landing and you feel confident, you feel that sense that you are speaking something that is so vitally true. People are taking notes, they're listening, they're not distracted. In these moments, you are the most likely to convince, to bring people in, to draw them in. But Gio, as you and I have been talking about what it means to be fascinating, I've started to take this lens, to take the lens of what does it mean when you feel fascinated, and instead start thinking about what are those qualities within you? What are those characteristics, those traits that make people love you and admire you and appreciate you and evangelize for you and promote you and pay for you to pay more for your products and services? And what I found is that we can measure this. We can measure what makes somebody fascinating. When I first started looking at this, when I first started about a decade ago, I began looking at what are the qualities that make somebody most valuable. And what I've been seeing lately is it's not just about being valuable, it's about understanding those qualities that you don't perceive as valuable, but other people perceive as being intrinsic to who you are. And a lot of times this comes back to feeling broken or flawed. And if I can, I'll give you an example, Gio. When I was young, my dad and I had a tradition. We would always go to get Krispy Kreme donuts on Sunday mornings, and we would always talk about. It was our bonding time over the course of the week because he's a surgeon and he wasn't always home for dinner. So one Sunday morning, we were driving over the bridge, and a tow truck slammed into the door of our car, and the car wrapped around a telephone pole. And my dad passed out, and when he regained consciousness, he saw that I wasn't breathing and my heart wasn't beating, and he climbed out of the windshield of the car and he pulled me out of the windshield and performed CPR in the street. And a friend of the family drove by and called my mom and said, "Your daughter's just been killed in a car accident." And after the surgeries, my face started to come back together, and I did regain consciousness, and I did regain my ability to interact. My brain hadn't died, but a lot of the muscles on the side of my face died. And it took years for my smile to come back. And during that period of time, I had this horrific grimace that when I would try to smile at somebody, when I would try to use that natural way that I would always connect as a little girl throughout my entire life, I would try to smile and they would look back at me in horror, like I was wearing a Halloween mask. And so at a really fundamental time of my life, I learned deeply what it means to not just feel flawed, but look broken. These horrible gashes. My mom was pulling shrapnel out of my hair for months afterwards because they just like a grenade had exploded in my face. And you can still see the scar. And if you look at my smile, I still have an uneven smile. But what came out of that mangled car wreck was a deep understanding and connection for the fact that all of us, whether we were in a car accident or not, all of us have these parts of ourselves that we loathe, and we pack them away, and we take the essential parts of ourselves that, just like me when I was a little girl and I had the ability to smile and to connect and to be funny and use humor and build relationships that way, that was shut down, cut off at the root of the nerve. We all do that. Somebody breaks up with us. A teacher tells us we're not good enough. We're fired from a job. We take that part of ourselves and we put it into a box, and we put the box on the shelf, and we close the lid and we walk away. And what I've been seeing in my newest research is the fact is the very things about you that you think you need to change are the very things that allow you to not just to be present and have a wellspring of energy, but these are the qualities that help you change the world. You don't have to change who you are. You have to become more of who you are. And so it was by earning the scars on my face, by going through that experience, that I gained an appreciation. I haven't had any more surgery on my scar, and in fact, I ended up, instead of getting that surgery, and I went and I lived in Africa and I studied female circumcision. I wanted to understand, what does it mean to be disempowered on the deepest level? And had it not been for that experience, I don't think I ever would have been able to dive deeply into this work of what it means to be different, to feel broken, to feel flawed, to whether you're part of an LGBT community or whether you're somebody who's struggling to come up with a new business model, whose clients ran away with the recessions that we've had. And so, Gio, when you talk about superpowers, I think your superpower is fundamentally, intrinsically inseparable from that very part of yourself that you try to hide from the world.
I think that, or I define superpower in relationship to how I also define the word gift as part of your difference. So I'll give you a story. Growing up, I was bullied for being smart, which I always found really, really strange, because there's traditional reasons why people bully other people. And I did IQ testing, was labeled, I have a super high IQ, went to a gifted class once a week at a different school. And every time I came back to my regular school, I was bullied. And it felt like a curse. And I felt like I had this curse. And in high school, discovered comic books, and that's why I fell in love with superheroes, because the X-Men, if you know the stories, the primary building is called the School for Gifted Youngsters, and there's that word, and it meant superpower. And fast forward to even a few years ago, I kept being told, you are such a good connector. And I didn't understand, because I just assumed, well, I like doing it, but it's just normal. Aren't we all like this? And you mentioned that you don't perceive your value. You think it's a natural thing. And this is the challenge I think most of us have, is that first we think our gift is a curse. So we hide it. And then we think it's not special or different. So we just make the assumption that we're just like everybody else. And it took me 1,000 people saying this connector thing. And then once I accepted, maybe this is something unique about me, what would it look like to harness this gift and to go deep into it and actually train and practice and master it? And now I consider it a superpower because I've gone through that process, right? And I feel like that's what you're talking about. To first identify the thing that you think might be a curse, or the thing you don't like, or the thing that made you stand out or different as a kid, especially. And you know, we have 3 boys here. And I believe that when we're younger, and I want to chat with both of you about how to identify all these things, or when does it start? But I noticed that in speaking to a lot of adults, it's the thing that they got in trouble for as a kid that becomes the superpower as an adult, because it's just intrinsically them. They can't turn it off, and kids don't have filters, right? So I'm curious, Jonathan, when it comes to what the things that make us come alive, when do they first develop? When can we first see this in ourselves or in our children, or when does it show up?
You're asking all the easy questions here early on. I love that. It's like, Sally has the perfect answer to that. But by the way, I just want to say, I love the conversation that you both just had, because like a central assumption to it is that like, it's not about asking the question like, how do I present as something different? It's about actually doing the work of seeing how you've always been different, and then just standing really fully in that. I think so many people go out into the world and they're like, ooh, I need to bolt this on or strap this on, or like do this different thing, or be wild in this way, or like build this persona around me so I can be different and stand out, even though it has nothing to do with sort of like innately who they are. And they inevitably crash and burn in whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish by doing that. And like what you're both offering up is this idea that it's not a fabrication, like it's not a thing that you find from the outside in. Like this is a part of like the fiber of your being, and it probably has been from the earliest days. And it's just a matter of like owning it. Like Gio, when you say often it was the thing that people get in trouble for when they're kids, I think I actually had the opposite experience, which is that it was the thing that was my solace when I was a kid. It was a thing that I would retreat to when I wanted to feel okay. But I would retreat to it often in private because it might not have been like the most social thing in the world. Also being wired on the more introverted side of the spectrum. So, for me, I think it's really interesting to sort of like ask the question, like if this did show up earlier in your life, how did it show up, and what job did it have for you? Because I think those are really interesting questions to start to suss it out. Like when you ask me, when do these things start to show up? So I get asked that a ton these days. And my focus is a little bit different. My focus is really, what is the deepest impulse for effort that gives you that feeling of coming alive that we talked about? But there's a lot of overlap in terms of what Sally's been researching for years and her evolution as well. And so I'm very regularly asked, is it nurture? Is it nature? Does it show up at birth? Is it ordained by some sort of, like a larger power? Is it built? Is it skill? The truth is, like I certainly have a ton of anecdotal evidence, and I have a really strong belief based on, being exposed to a large body of work now for a long time. But I also want to throw out the proviso in that, to answer that question from any sort of legitimate, validated, vetted scientific standpoint would be impossible to do, because you would literally have to give somebody a set of experiences or surveys, or like analyze them, at birth, and then continue to track that throughout the entirety of their lives. So from a practical standpoint, even if you could devise a way to figure out when do these things touch down in us, practical standpoint, it's just not doable. And then there are, like a bajillion confounding variables that drop into our path when we're trying to do that. That said, I think we probably, I'm guessing like the three of us probably have a pretty strong sense that these things tend to show up really early in life, regardless of where you believe they came from. And it's my belief also, in the context at least of this impulse that I study, the Sparcotype, that it tends to show up early in life. I do believe that it's ingrained in us in some way, shape, or form. And people sometimes really don't like that idea. If you tell somebody you've got 3 different kids and their eyes are 3 different colors and they're going to be those same different colors for the entire lives, they're like, cool, that's a trait. Like, I get that. But if you tell them something that's sort of like more psychologically wrapped around them and say, like, this is fairly stable for life, people tend to really reject that, because we always want to feel like we are perpetually changeable. And in many ways we are. But then in many ways, like any parent knows about kids, they come out at birth with different personalities, different wirings, different preferences, tendencies, and behaviors. So when I look at this, I look at the impulse that I examine, that I research, and I do see it showing up very early in life with the vast majority of people, and staying fairly stable throughout life. So like my primary impulse, my primary Sparcotype, which means it's the strongest impulse for effort that gives me that feeling of coming alive, is what I call the maker. Gio, I believe that we share that in common, if I'm right, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So the impulse of the maker is to make ideas manifest. It's all about the process of creation. It's the something from nothing impulse. It is this fiercely generative impulse to invest energy for no other reason than you get the opportunity to build something from nothing. And a lot of people just assume, but everybody has that, and in fact, everybody doesn't have that. And Gio, that goes back to what you were saying, and Sally, to a certain extent, what you were saying too, in that when we're wired a certain way, it's sort of like if you're a hammer, all the world is a nail. We think everybody is wired similarly,
Right.
because it's so natural to us. And then we would discover, no, actually, not everybody is the same as us. Like, we're different in a particular way. It's kind of wild. But so my impulse, my maker impulse, has shown up from my earliest possible memory and has never left me. It's presented in, like endless different ways. When I was a little kid, I would actually have my parents drive me to the town dump in the town that I grew up in. We'd open up the back of the Chevy Blazer. We'd throw in all these like discarded bicycle parts, and we'd bring them home. I'd lug them into my garage, and I'd like bring out a big old roll of duct tape, and I'd piece them together into these Franken bikes with like 3 sets of choppers, and I'd ride around the neighborhood until they spontaneously combusted. And, I ran home and got bandaged up, and then I'd go back like the next Sunday and do it. That over time emerged into learning how to paint. It emerged into building houses. It emerged into building businesses, brands, books, experiences, media. But the fundamental impulse under all of it has been this singular through line that has been with me from, I can't tell you it was from like the moment that I entered the world, but from my earliest sentient moments. That has been the impulse that has been fueling me. So my sense is that these things really stay with us from the earliest moments. I'm so curious, Sally, too, like what your take is, because I think there is this really interesting overlap with what we've been studying. What's your sense of this question? I'm so curious.
Gio, can you repeat the question so I can make sure that I'm not
Yeah,
getting
for sure.
distracted by this awesome image of Jonathan driving around, riding around his neighborhood with an exploding bicycle strapped together with chewing gum and shoelaces?
With respect to early age, when do these gifts start to manifest? When do the superpowers or traits become apparent?
Well, the traits show up really early. If you go back and you look at photographs of yourself when you're 3 years old, 4 years old, nobody has shut you down. You're not insecure yet, and you probably look like more of yourself in those photographs than you do when you're on a Zoom call like this. But I want to take it a step further. Here's something I've noticed ever since the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, we realized very quickly that the qualities that made us really successful in our careers, our personal brands, those qualities that people use to define us, the ones that got us where we were, all of a sudden the value on those radically changed. And here's what I mean by that. I think we're going through a collective identity crisis right now, in which we created cages for ourselves. I think our personal brands have become cages that have become, they're imprisoning us. It's like, I used to be the one imagine a pre-pandemic, right? A big part of my personal brand was being high energy, being energetic, and being on stage in a certain way. And you know what? It got really exhausting when that started to feel like it was a masquerade. You know, when you become known for certain traits, it's not that you're authentically generating them, it's that you're plastering them on yourself because that's what other people expect of you. I think this is something that during COVID, all of that got shaken up, and we sort of came together with this identity crisis of saying, do we still want to be associated with the same qualities as we did before? And Gio, did you feel like, well, actually, I'm going to tell you a secret, Gio. The photograph, the photograph that is that was used in the promotion of this is a photograph that's 12 years old. Now, here's why I want to tell you that's interesting. It's not just that the photograph is still on Google. I didn't get a new headshot for 8 years because I was so freaked out. I mean, here's one of the things about being an author, being a speaker, where your headshot is really the one that's doing the speaking for you. There's so many variables in a headshot. You've got the body posture, the wardrobe, the background, the situation of the lighting, the photography style, the cropping, the energy, big eye contact, or more serious, staid, introspective. And so all of these thousands of data points in a single photograph can determine whether or not you're hired or respected. And these photographs have an incredibly long shelf life, not just on Google. It's that everybody tends to pull the same photographs. And so it becomes super intimidating to put yourself out there to get a new headshot. And you know what it's kind of like? It's catfishing. You know what catfishing is?
Yeah.
Okay, so in online dating, it's like you're presenting yourself as something that either used to be, or it's like using too much of an Instagram filter. I think a lot of us right now are having this reckoning. We're struggling, we're uncomfortable. It's we're all pre-breakthrough, because a lot of the habits that we used to have about the ways we interacted, suddenly we need to stop catfishing and break out of those out of the old stereotypes, the old qualities that we used to define ourselves, that being the funny guy worked then and it doesn't work anymore. Being the pretty one worked then and doesn't necessarily work anymore. And the same goes for a lot of us. I mean, have you ever felt that way, Jonathan, that you needed to do some kind of a reset?
Wait, are you referencing the headshot that I use with the full set of curly hair and puka beads? No, never, not at all. Yeah, I mean, don't we all, right? You know, and I think once, and I think so many of us, right? We build our livings, we build our reputations, we build our brand, our status, our affiliations around a certain perception of who we are and the value that we offer to the world. And then we're evolving personally, we're evolving internally, because we're human beings, right? We're learning more about ourselves, about the world, about what we want to lean into and pull back from. And yet I think there's this, and Sally, I think you nailed it, right? I think so often, once we feel like we're locked into a value paradigm and a perception paradigm, and we've built a sustainable living around it, especially, and we get terrified of stepping away from that public facade, because we associate everything that it's given us with that. Even though like we start waking up month after month after month, knowing that there's a bigger and bigger gap between what that thing is and who we are becoming. And I think you nailed it, right? It's like, if that was happening at a gradual pace over time, which it is for all of us as we grow, the last 2 years have been like a 10x accelerator on that process. And it's dropped us all into this massive existential question. Are you in that same place, Gio? I'm curious.
I feel fortunate that before all of this weirdness, I was doing a lot of work in terms of answering this question that plagued me for decades. And the question was, or the statement, sorry, was, be yourself. And every time I heard that phrase, I was like, what does this mean? It's so freaking frustrating. What the hell does this mean? And because of my own journey. And I also believe that, so to give some context, prior to launching Archangel, I was in the real estate space and I did really, 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 really well. And secretly I hated it, but my identity and my reputation was attached to how well I was doing. I was winning every award and featured in magazines. And how do you tell people that the person doing all this and being on paper successful not only isn't happy, but is depressed and anxious and 70 pounds overweight and all these things, and also not in relationship? And then I think when I met my now fiance, Stephanie, and at the same time I quit real estate because Archangel started growing and doing really well. And I felt the alignment of truth with the work I was doing and who I was surrounding myself with. And I keep telling Stephanie, you're the first person I've ever been completely myself with, where I haven't had to act or pretend or worry about saying or doing the wrong thing. And that transformation in terms of my career and the work I'm doing and the people I'm surrounding myself with has allowed me to feel like I don't even have to think about the question or the statement anymore. So when all of this weirdness happened, nothing actually changed. And I keep telling people, one of the weirdest or coolest things was that I had zero anxiety. But looking around, there was a lot of panic and anxiety. So I thought, because I feel this way, it's my responsibility to step up and serve and help a lot more people. We started doing a lot more. And I still feel that way. And I've been on this quest for equanimity and just feeling like complete peace as much as possible. So that's been me, and that's been my journey. So I don't think I've had it in the same way, but I recognize and the messaging I think for everyone listening or watching is the idea of turning crisis into opportunity, and to figure out how can we do that. And I want to share that message and support people with thinking that.
Thank you for saying that. You're hugely inspirational, to a lot of community, a lot of us on the call, including Jonathan and me. Thank you.
Jonathan, before we continue, I feel like we need to define what a Sparcotype is.
So it's my strong belief, and now the research is really bearing it out, that we each have a unique impulse for effort that gives us that feeling of coming alive. And I spend a chunk of time mapping out what are these impulses? Actually, it started with a research question. Are they mappable? Are they definable? I actually didn't think they were in the beginning. And I thought if they were, well, you'd have like 7.8 billion of them, because there's 7.8 billion people, and they've got to, we're all our own unique people. And then when you start actually looking at giant lists of industries, roles, jobs, titles, and deconstructing, well, what are the fundamental units of effort? What are the way that we exert ourselves within them? It deconstructs really quickly to this fairly universal set of 10 different impulses for effort. And they show up in different percentages in different jobs, experiences, and roles. And once I identified those 10 different impulses, what I realized was each one of those impulses also tends to have its own definable set of preferences, behaviors, and tendencies that wrap around it that form archetypes. So the Sparcotype it starts with these 10 different impulses, and then it factors in, it brings in the preferences, behaviors, and tendencies that are associated with each one of them. And every person has their own blend of these things. But what we've seen is that we tend to have one or two that are really dominant, that are really, really strong impulses on one side of the spectrum, but also on the other side of the spectrum, we tend to have one that I call the Anti-Sparcotype, which is also, it's the type of work that's the heaviest lift, requires the greatest amount of recovery, the greatest extrinsic motivation if we're tasked with doing it. That doesn't mean that we don't ever have to do it. It may well be a part of the job that we're saying yes to, or we may just do it on a values basis because it's something that, even though we know it takes more out of us and requires a greater recovery. We have a strong value wrapped around doing that kind of work. And honoring that value alone is a source of meaning for us. So when I talk about the Sparcotype, I'm talking about those impulses, behaviors, tendencies, and preferences that form these imprints or Sparcotypes. And I talk about them in the context of a person's Sparcotype profile. And that has these three elements: your primary Sparcotype, the strongest impulse, your what I call your shadow Sparcotype. And that's not shadow as in like the Jungian way. That's it. The impulse that's sort of like the next strongest impulse, or it lives in the shadow of the primary. And we see a really interesting relationship most often, which is that you do the work of your shadow. You like it, you're good at it, it's nourishing, but very often you do it so that you can do the work of your primary at a much higher level. And there's that anti-Sparcotype. And just for clarity, I'll give you a quick example of what a profile might look like. So let's say a person has a primary of a sage, a shadow of a maven, and an anti of a performer. Now let's talk about what that is. The sage, the impulse is to awaken insight. It's all about illumination. You know something, but it really doesn't matter. It's not the joy of knowing that gives you everything. It's what happens when you see the lights of understanding and discovery and insight go on when you share it with other people. That may show up in the role of a teacher, but it also could show up in the role of a parent or a coach or a mentor or a rabbi or so many different ways. The maven impulse, which in this case, so in that example, the sage would be your primary. That is your strongest impulse. That's what gets you out of bed in the morning. The shadow is the maven. Now, the impulse of the maven is knowledge acquisition. It's all about an impulse to just learn as much as humanly possible. It shows up generally in two different ways. One is a broad, pervasive curiosity about everyone and everything. The other is a very focused fascination with a particular topic or person or idea or ideals. And you go narrow and deep and devote all of your energy to it. And then there's sort of like a hybrid of the two. It's all about knowledge acquisition. That really lights you up. So how does that pairing work together? Well, the primary thing is your sage. You just want to illuminate and awaken insight. But it's really hard to do that if you don't know something that you can share. So the maven is something that you enjoy doing, you enjoy learning, but when it's in the role of your shadow, it actually is the thing that allows you to consume information and then turn to the sage side and use that to translate what you've learned into useful intel that awakens insight and illuminates on that side. So it serves to allow you to do the work of your primary at a higher level. And then on that other end of the spectrum, the anti-Sparcotype, if we say that's the performer in the example that I gave, well, the impulse for the performer is to animate, enliven, and energize an interaction, experience, moment. Interestingly, in our data, that is the least represented primary Sparcotype, and I believe the last time I checked, the most represented anti-Sparcotype, which goes along with the generations-long research that people have about fear of speaking in an interesting way. So what it tells you, though, is there's an assumption that to be a really effective sage or teacher or presenter, you have to be in this hyper animated, energizing, enlivening mode. This is what Sally was talking about earlier, right? That's the only way to be effective because that is the norm in society. But what if your wiring says, stepping into that mode, you're capable of doing it. You may have developed the skill of being good at it, but it's really draining for you to be in that space, and it requires a ton of recovery. And then the context of your life over time, it becomes more emptying than fulfilling. Well, then you actually get to say, well, but is that true? Like, do I actually have to be a performer to be a really effective and fulfilled sage? And the answer is, of course not. You can do it from the role of, like being fiercely animated and energizing, but you can also be deeply earnest and compassionate and direct. So it's really interesting to be able to understand what the imprints are, understand what your unique profile is, and then how these different elements play together. So that was a longer answer than I was expecting to give, but I hope it provided context about like sort of what I'm really talking about when I use the word Sparcotype or Sparcotype profile.
I feel like both of your research and work is role and industry agnostic. like I think a question that everyone's going to come up with or wonder is, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right type of work for me? Am I in the right field? How do I know? And I'm sensing that it's not necessarily about the role. It's about how you perform or show up. And I'm curious, this is for either of you, what is the relationship between the things that are, or the things that make you fascinating and your impulses to the type of work you're doing? And I have a feeling if I said this, because I get this question all the time, like, if I want to transition to something else, should I just quit? And my answer is no, never. But I'm curious how you perceive or answer this question too, because I have a feeling the two of you get it way more than I do. Like, Sally, what is the relationship between someone's role, whether they are any kind of leader, entrepreneur type person, or working on a team, and their fascination?
There are two things that define a high performer. There are two specific qualities. My research of over 1 million professionals inside of Twitter, Porsche, Facebook, on and on throughout different industries, over 200,000 high-level entrepreneurs. What we found was two things define the high performers from the average performers. Now, when we originally started doing this research, I thought it was going to come back to education level, network, skills. And in fact, I was totally wrong. The two things that make the high performers at a completely different strata, first of all, they deliver a specific benefit. So the people who are detail oriented are really detail oriented, and they look for the projects and for the clients and for the opportunities. They're going to allow them to show up as the detail person. They don't want to be the rah-rah. They don't want the big picture thinker. Instead, they double down on that as a specialty. And the second thing that they do is they do it with intention. In other words, they're very clear. They can't be all things to all people. You are not perfect for every job. You are not perfect for every client, and they are not perfect for you. When you can identify which are the clients and the opportunities and the projects and the partners and the relationships that are going to allow you to make sure that you don't get distracted by putting your energy into things in which you will never be able to be perceived at your highest value. Instead, if you double down on finding that unique specialty and then doing it with intention. And I'll give you an example. When you talked about the way things are changing with the economy, when we need to evolve our businesses, you can change your job title, you can change your role. Those kinds of things can and should change many times throughout your career. The point is that it's not about what you do. It's about who you are. And what I found when I was looking at the people who were at the top paid brackets within any industry, they weren't being paid for what they do. What they do is a commodity. You're a dentist. I'm a dentist. You drill holes, fillings. I do. I'm not a dentist, so I shouldn't even use that as an example. What you do can be replaced. What you do can be outperformed. What you do can be trumped in a minute with a new technology, a shinier trophy. But who you are and those specific traits within yourself that allow you to show up at your best confidently every time. Nobody else can replicate that, steal that, patent that, or outdo you at it. So the question is not what you do. The question is, how do you build a career, build a job, build a company in which you show up specifically, intentionally, purposefully as who you are, and then attract the right clients who want you to do exactly that over and over again. That's what the high performers who are paid at the highest brackets are doing, both as entrepreneurs and otherwise. People like you, Gio, and you, Jonathan.
Jonathan, what about you?
Yeah, I'm just smiling because I totally agree with that. Can I just say what Sally said? And you're right. Like I get asked this question mercilessly, and not in a bad way. Of course, it's a really important question that everybody wants to know. As soon as they discover their Sparcotype profile, the next question tends to be, what job should I be looking for? And so we've developed a lot of, like responses to that and language around that, because that is the traditional sort of like next step. Okay, show me the list of things that I should be doing. And it's exactly what Sally was saying. It's like, these are things where it is a deeper imprint where it gives you, when you understand what this deeper imprint is, it gives you the freedom to now step out of the constraints of some arbitrary short list of jobs that you're supposed to pursue, or that are conventionally the places where like people quote like you, like should be able to flourish. And it allows you to look at the universe of opportunities, whether that's a new project in your company or a new team, or completely like a new job title or role, a new industry, whatever it may be. It allows you to look out at that and basically just say, okay, I now know in much more granular terms, what opportunities for me to exert myself need to be present in any job, any role, for me to show up and be at my best and feel like I'm fully alive. And I can just look at any job, any industry, any role, any project, any team, any product, any service, and ask, is the opportunity to do that, to be that, just step into this role, is that present for me, regardless of what the title is, regardless of what the job description is? And even if it's not, you can ask yourself, well, how close does it get me? And is it the type of position where I will either have or can earn the agency and power to reimagine whatever place it doesn't allow me to do this, so that with like a fairly short amount of time, I will be able to do it. And what, the things that we're talking about here, we're talking about freedom. Fundamentally, we're talking about gaining a level of personal awareness, self-knowledge, that allows us to, sure, if you want to start with a typical short list, and a lot of people do, maybe it's a first step in, that's great. But the big concern is that that tends to be both a beginning and an end for most people. And when you do that, you're fantastically constraining the future of your working life and your life by some arbitrary short list that somebody put together probably 2 generations ago that said this should fit you. So I totally agree with Sally. So much less about the role, and it's about how you step into that particular thing. That's really much more determinative. At least that's what we're seeing in so much of the research that we're doing on this side too.
Isn't there also a challenge that most of us face, where there's this paradigm we're taught when we're young around being happy? And I remember my childhood, or even I've said this about my kids too, and I feel like, wait a minute, I got to figure this out. Where people talk about their children, they say, well, all I really want is for my kids to be happy. I want them to be happy. And I feel like that's the messaging all of us get, without any distinction or clarification or direction around what that looks like and what it even means. And one of my best friends is a happiness researcher, and you can't actually always be happy. And it's this weird goal where many of us strive towards, and then in the pursuit of it, we realize if it's not happening, the opposite happens, where we feel like we're depressed because we're not happy. So what you, Jonathan, started by saying that your work helps people figure out meaning and fulfillment. And what is the relationship to happiness? Is happiness part of this equation?
And there's plenty of, you're right, there's a ton of research on this these days, especially emerging from the world of positive psychology. And what's kind of crystal clear now is happiness is the snapshot, and meaning is the movie. Happiness, as you described, is not a sustainable state, even though a lot of pop psychology and personal development lore and a whole lot of memes on social media suggest that can and should be the goal. But what you're actually doing when you say like the end goal is to be perpetually happy, to be always happy, is you're setting yourself and others up for shame and futility, because it's actually not an attainable or sustainable outcome. And the research backs that up. What is sustainable over time through practice is meaning, because You can derive meaning when you're unhappy. You can derive meaning when you're ill. You can derive meaning when you're experiencing exclusion or isolation or ostracization. You can derive meaning through suffering. You can derive meaning through joy. You can derive meaning through happiness, through love, through work, through effort. Like this is a state that can be accessed almost regardless of whatever the circumstance of your life is, right? And meaning is a central question of life, not happiness. Midlife crisis is not a crisis of happiness. It's not a crisis of money. It's not a crisis of status. It's not a crisis of love. It's not a crisis of belonging. It's an existential crisis. It's a crisis of meaning. And that's the moment where we all reach that point and say, like, is this all there is? I've been devoting everything to this, right? And we may have had plenty of moments of happiness. I have had countless moments where I've been like rolling on the floor, laughing legitimately, where I've like looked across a room and seen my daughter just like doing something that she loves doing. And I'm just smiling in every cell in my body. Like, but even like those are the things that are tend to be fleeting. And the other thing is we habituate to those states. And they in relatively short order stop giving us that feeling, whereas we don't ever really habituate to circumstances that allow us to derive meaning in our lives. So yeah, I agree, you know, and it's one of the reasons why I actually don't talk about happiness a lot. And I happen to be friends with a number of like leading happiness researchers too, and we have these conversations. And there was a season where the market was flooded with a lot of happiness books, and the books were generally pretty good at actually telling the truth about what this is and what isn't. But then the popular coverage tended to tell a different story. And circling back to that story, like we're all parents, right? Is the, when you ask a parent, like, what do you want for your kid? Like the first answer off the tongue, it generally is happiness. It's also a lie. There's something else that every parent wants for their kid more than happiness, and that's they want them to be safe and well. And when we set, this expectation that happiness is the thing we want for ourselves and we want most for our kids, it's really we're setting these things that aren't true and often aren't attainable. And my concern is always that it's more destructive than constructive.
Sally, what about the relationship between what makes you valuable and how many of us suffer from issues with self-worth and the topic of imposter syndrome? We've been having so many conversations in our group coaching calls and different conversations I've been having, and this theme of imposter syndrome often comes up, and also a theme of or the question of, who am I to fill in the blank? Who am I to lead this thing? Who am I to create this thing? And I'm wondering what you see as a relationship between the things that make you valuable and self-worth.
The answer is a little bit surprising. It's about knowing who to alienate so that you can identify exactly the right people to attract, and then not trying to make everyone happy. If you try to be right for everyone, you'll be right for no one. If you try to be perfect for everyone in your life, every client, do everything absolutely right, if you try to be better, you'll only be worse. And so if we look at the world of branding, the brands that are the most loved and admired are the ones that are very clear on who they want to talk to. And I'll give you a kind of crazy example. There was a this is where it can go to the extreme. Think about the word different. Think about it that the easiest level is to be a little bit original, a little bit unusual, new, fresh, novelty. But if you go all the way to the most different that you can possibly be, then you might become audacious. You might become startling. Well, this is where you need to start thinking about your brand instead of thinking, how do I be a person? How do I live a life? How do I have a company and have relationships? in which everything runs exactly to plan, and I always make other people happy. Well, so let's come back to this example that I was telling you. There was a theme park named Action Park, and I got the nickname Traction Park because when they built this theme park, they didn't actually hire engineers. They hired teenagers who were probably wasted half the time. And they created roller coasters that had loop-de-loops. And in one case, when they did a trial run with the loop-de-loop, somebody got stuck at the top of the loop. And so they had to actually cut him out of the loop. Now, what does this have to do with joy and happiness? Well, this is an extreme example of being polarizing. They were very clear. Action Park was very clear on the kind of customers and writers that they wanted to attract. And they became so popular, so wildly popular, that even when the ambulance stopped coming to Action Park because they had so many people going to the hospital, they just hired their own ambulances. They literally bought an ambulance company. The insurance company tried to shut them down. So they started their own insurance company because the demand was so high and people were willing to pay anything in order to have this wild adrenaline rush. This, you can only find it in one place. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting that we build loop-de-loops in which people have to be cut out by the fire department. What I am suggesting, though, is the more clearly you can define who you are right for and who is right for you, the more specifically you know which relationships allow you to show up at your best, those qualities within you that you love, that other people will love in you. The more clear you can become about who you're not, the more you can build a life and a career and a business and an identity in which you don't feel like an imposter because you're never trying to be something that you're not. I'll tell you, I experienced kind of the same sort of identity crisis of being all things to all people. I got to a point in my career in 2018 where it felt like instead of me authentically deciding who I was, I started looking at the scores and the reviews and the Amazon feedback and what people wrote and what people said. And all of a sudden I went dead in the eyes. And it was around that time, Gio, you might remember, I took a 1-year sabbatical and my kids called my Sally Batical. And what I got really clear on in this year away from reading any feedback was that the part of myself that I love is the dorkiest, geekiest, introvertedest part. I was the state mime champion, and I've always carried a badge of shame around this. And now I realize, if anything, I want to be the state mime champion again. And so I think for all of us, when we feel lost, we don't need to go out and look for those answers. We need to come back and decide and not be afraid to define who we're not so that we can throw ourselves wholeheartedly into who we are.
I think one of the biggest puzzles to solve that I've identified is that when we're born, we are fully ourselves. We don't have a filter. And then as we start to age, we get shaped by being told the things we need to stop doing so that we, in quotes, fit in. And I think scientifically, there's a part of our limbic brain, like our animal brain or our ancient brain, when we were very tribal, that said, if you are not part of the tribe, you're dead, because being excluded from the tribe meant some tiger was going to eat you. So there was protection from the group. So we have these two opposing needs that are always in conflict, one of standing out and being ourselves and one of fitting in. And I feel like we're, even watching parents with children, they're always telling them how to stop standing out so that they can fit in. Or in schools, literally, like, line up kids, stop talking children, be in rows, all these kinds of things. So we're constantly taught how to fit in. And then as adults, we realize it's in, like you said, Sally, it's in the standing out where we are most valuable. So how do we
Okay.
How do we change the desire, or how do we solve the equation of not needing to fit in and standing out and not being afraid of it because it feels like death. Like this is, I think, the biggest problem. There's this such a huge fear that standing out means we're going to die.
No little kid ever came home from school crying, running into the arms of their parent and saying, "Mommy, mommy, the other kids say I'm better." we were given the wrong yardstick. And I think that now is the time when we need to stop evaluating ourselves in direct comparison to other people. And we need to begin to say, there is only one winner in the world of better, and everybody gets to win. Not only everybody gets to win, but everybody gets to be fully self-expressed and profitable and valuable and thriving and confident and loving talking with you on a phone call when we understand what makes us different. It's good to be better, but it's better to be different.
Jonathan, what about the idea of purpose? You mentioned it earlier as one of the variables, and I speak to a lot of people who keep saying that they're trying to find their purpose. And other words that I've heard being used, one of my favorite words is calling. And I love Joseph Campbell, and I love the hero's journey. And I also love the concept of finding your bliss and all of the relationship here and how it relates to the idea that we are all heroes on our own hero's journey. Once you discover your Sparcotype and you invest in it, what's the relationship then with your path and your purpose and the work you're meant to do?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, but first, I can't stop thinking about Sally miming, and like, I'm almost desperate to see her show us a little bit of like those mad skills.
Hey, I know I did, and you know what's great? The bar is so low to be a mime. Okay, Jonathan, give me a mime. Give me a mime challenge.
Like, is this like mime improv?
Yeah.
Okay. Doing your presenting to your second grade class, doing a book report to your second grade class.
that got very specific. Okay. So and you know what? I get to have the constraints. First of all, I'm a second grader too. And second of all, I have a chocolate candy bar. And third of all, it's really, really windy in the room. Okay. So now I'm doing the book report. So I'm going to start. Okay.
Anyone listening in on iTunes right now, this is the perfect opportunity to go to YouTube.
You know, actually, I'll tell you, I was also kicked off the cheerleading squad because, and like, this was my claim to fame in high school. While everybody else in my family was wildly successful, I was, like guys really dug it. Dave Pine came and kicked off the cheerleading squad.
That's too funny. Well, that was fantastic. And by the way, as a kid, I went to Action Park many times and left quite a bit of skin there. So
we didn't have to scrape you out of the loop-de-loop, right?
No, it wasn't that bad, but I remember those days well. All right, so Gio, getting back to your question about purpose. Yeah, purpose is one of those words that is thrown around an awful lot these days. It's been sort of co-opted to mean a ton of different things, and there's a lot of mythology around it. And there's also this one idea of like one solitary life purpose, which I'm not entirely sure I buy into. And that's why I described it in two different contexts. When I mentioned it as one of the 5 elements of the Sparcotype, because I think it tends to show up in 2 different ways in people's lives. One is having an immediate sense of purpose. There can be any number of things that give you a sense of purpose. taking care of somebody who you love dearly can give you a sense of purpose, like for a certain moment or season or window of time. Doing the work of your Sparcotype can give you a sense of purpose, like while you're doing it. Honoring a deeply held value can give you a strong sense of purpose. So there are so many ways, different potential pathways to actually do things or engage in activities that will give you a sense of purpose, either for a moment or for a window or for a season or for life. So it's not limited to one particular pursuit or activity or identity. So that's one thing is what do we do that gives us a sense of purpose? And that can show up in so many different ways. The Sparcotypes, for sure, investing effort in a way that is deeply aligned with this imprint. People report back to us that it definitely, it correlates strongly with having that sense. But when you zoom the lens out, and this is where I think, Gio, like you hear the term life purpose, there's in the literature, the phrase that is most often used in sort of academic research that I've seen is the phrase purpose in life. I said, do you have purpose in life? And again, that can be derived in a lot of different things. And there's clear correlations when people say they have a purpose in life. That correlates strongly with everything from improved performance, from a business standpoint, but also things like health outcomes, mental health outcomes, state of disease and illness and well-being, longevity. So they're really powerful, both physiological and psychological correlations with experiencing either this more immediate sense of purpose, like you're working towards something that matters to you, and a broader sense of purpose in life, like the way that you're moving through life is giving you this sense of purpose. So when I look at the relationship between the Sparcotypes and those two different contexts, we see in the research that it tends to really correlate strongly with those two different expressions of purpose. But I back away from this really popular phrase life purpose, because it implies that you have a singular purpose, that everybody is put here for a singular purpose on that planet. And very often part of that implication is that it's preordained or predefined genetically. And that unless and until you find that one thing, that one conduit, that one path, you cannot live a life of purpose. How utterly defeating is that to the average person? So you mean maybe I have to wait until I'm like 65 years old when I run like 522 experiments and finally get that to now be able to live a life of purpose? Really? And what if I never actually stumble upon it? Does that mean that my life is just a waste? Because I haven't discovered that singular thing that I'm here to do on the planet. And again, I literally just wrote about this in my newsletter today. There are these tropes and self-help platitudes and aphorisms that simplify these ideas because we want life to be simple. But the idea of purpose is actually really nuanced and complex. And when we simplify it and then say there's a single thing that we should all aspire to, and that's the thing that gives your life purpose, and unless until you find it, you're kind of busted. It drops us into a place of futility and shame unless and until we get there. And that to me is just the most horrendous thing to layer onto somebody, when anybody can literally like wake up in the morning on any given day and do a dozen different things that will give them a sense of purpose. And anyone can actually reimagine or navigate or craft their work into a way or a pursuit that allows them to express something deeper inside of them, like 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, that will also allow them to derive this broader sense of purpose. Like I'm doing something that I feel like I'm here to do, and that may evolve and change over time, So it tends to be this really complex topic. It's actually really well researched. And at the same time, we tend to really want to distill it down into these platitudes and memes that we see on social media that not only in my mind get it wrong, but they also potentially do harm.
I feel like there's we have to note the difference between the journey versus the destination. We're maybe way too focused on the destination that we forget the journey. And I'm wondering, how can we shape our days? So like, and this is, by the way, coming from a person who basically lives in the future. I feel like I live in the future and I time travel back to hang out with all of you in the present, but still we're so hyper focused on like even purpose as a destination. Like one day I'm going to get to this place. And then we almost forget to celebrate the journey along the way. And how can we focus more on the journey itself and to feel like we're having, let's say, the best day ever, and try to replicate that as much as possible and figure out what are the habits every day that lead to meaning and fulfillment.
I had a crazy experience this morning. I was hanging out with Deepak Chopra. I mean, like, how crazy is that? I was with a group of people and he was the speaker, and he took us through guided meditation. And I got to admit something. I actually have never been very good at meditation. I'm not even good at yoga. I mean, Jonathan, you're you're so good at mindfulness, and I totally suck at it. But I got to tell you, when Deepak Chopra takes you through this thing, it's like suddenly you can access a different state of being. And this is exactly what he was talking about when he was describing that I'm not going to do it justice. In fact, odds are you have one of his books on your shelf, so you can go and read it from the book better than I can describe it. But what I profoundly got was, it's because I'm constantly living in the future in a bad way, not like you, Geo, not like not creating the future, but what's the next thing on my list that I have to be stressed about? Which notification is going to come up next that's going to be a little fire? And I've gotten too good at being to anticipate these crazy tiny little things instead of being able to just drop out, quiet down, and be able to think more deeply on the kinds of big, heavy lifting, joy creating, creative tasks that, for some reason, in the always on post-COVID culture, I for one have kind of recommitted to that journey and not the destination of the to-do list. I mean, I recommitted as of like 5 hours ago. So check. I obviously don't have a good attention span.
It's a solid 5 hours. You get full credit.
Dude, it's like dog years, you know? That was last week.
Do you know what's so fascinating too? I don't, yeah, we've all known each other for a number of years now, but I don't think I've ever known, like there's a thing that the three of us share in common, which is all three of us sound like we're fiercely future oriented. And it's been that way for my entire life. And it sounds like it's been that way for your life, so much so that, but I'm not so much future oriented in that I'm projecting what can go wrong and living in a state of anxiety. I'm opportunity future. I'm like possibility oriented in like far into the future. So I'm like, you know, I'm constantly looking 1, 3, 5, 10 years down the road. I'm like, where are we going? And how can I play a role in helping us get there? So I'm very future oriented in a possibility way, not so much in a dwelling or an anxiety way. And that sounds like, well, that's actually okay. That's like a cool way to be future oriented, right? And I'm so curious how this lands with both of you, because what I've come to believe is like, it's kind of like a yes and no answer. Like, yes, because from an innovation standpoint, it for sure, it helps me really spend a lot of time like seeing patterns and data and figuring out what's coming and helping to actually play a role in bringing it into existence. But at the same time, there's so much that I'm blessed to have in my life right now, today, in this moment. Like I'm hanging out talking with you and an amazing community of like 100 or so people who are gathering us in this conversation. And yet like I'll catch my brain flittering out into a conversation I had 3 hours ago about Web3 and the future of this. And I'm like so excited by all these things. And I'm like, no, dude, I've got this beautiful experience that I want to be a part of and really enjoy. And I've got people I love in my life and things I want to do. So my practice has really been to bring myself back, and create sort of like anchor practices throughout the day to keep coming back there. And it sounds like we're wired really. So I'm curious whether whether you guys are wired in a futuristic way or a future looking way, similarly or differently.
I spend a lot of time dreaming, and let me just share this fun thing I like to tell people now. And actually, let me ask everyone here who's with us live and watching in the future. When you were a child, do you remember using your imagination a lot? So that's the first question I like to ask. And everyone always says, yeah. And then I'll ask, today, do you believe you use your imagination as much as you did when you were a kid? And pretty much there's always one person who says yes, and pretty much everyone says not really or no. And I say, I challenge you, because I believe you do. You use your imagination just as much. The problem is you don't call it that anymore. You call it anxiety. And when we were kids, our imagination was creating a thing that didn't exist, but there was always a positive outcome because we weren't taught the opposite. And now as adults, we imagine a future that doesn't exist, and we perceive a possible negative outcome, and we feel fear, and we feel anxiety, and we feel stress, the adult word for fear, the adult word that's masked to make it less stressful than fear. And I think the practice I've had for myself is, what if I continue to use my imagination with a positive ending, with a happy ever after? And I feel like we're often, as adults, wired to think in that negative way as a protection mechanism. But if you make it a habit of dreaming way bigger with a potential positive outcome, your body can't tell the difference between the present and the future. So you react either way in the present. So if you feel those negative charged emotions, nothing's actually happened to you, which is fascinating. So you can actually do you can do the opposite. You can dream of something amazing in the future and feel the positive emotions today and not have the same negative physiological outcomes. So I practice time travel a lot. I speak to my future self all the time. I speak to little me all the time. And I try to also stay grounded in today through gratitude and appreciation. But time travel is a lot of fun.
Do you have a passenger seat?
Yeah. I have the biggest jumbo jet. For all of us fit on it. Yeah, for sure. I want to end by asking you the same question, which is, what is one thing or action step or advice you would give to all of us in terms of a next step? Like what's one thing we can do right now that leads us towards either going deeper into our impulses and Sparcotype, or doing more that fascinates us through our fascination?
I would take a look at yourself over the course of the next day and watch those places where you have a critical conversation, where you are you're not coaching yourself, you're criticizing yourself, you're insulting yourself, you're being unkind or even cruel to yourself. And I want you to pause and think about, what are the times in your life when the very quality that you're identifying actually was the key that unlocked some kind of a success. And that success might have been compassion for a friend. It might have been a professional victory. It might even be something small, like the way in which you presented a book report to a second grade class. But to be able to find that within those so-called flaws, the ways in which you're supposedly broken, that's actually your greatest glory. Because it's what makes you different.
Beautiful. Jonathan?
So my first impulse, of course, was to say, go take the Sparcotype assessment. It's free online for everyone. But it's like way too self-serving, even though honestly, it's like a really easy 10-minute first step in. But I'll plant another seed, even if like you don't have access to anything. There's a really simple question that I like to ask to start to key in on like, what is that thing inside of me that helps me in the context of when I'm doing something, helps me have that feeling of coming alive. And that's ask yourself, when I think back to the moments, experiences, interactions, endeavors in the past, especially when you were younger, what were the moments, what were the things, what were the pursuits where I lost time, where I literally blinked and I thought I was doing it for 10 minutes and 12 hours had passed? I think that's a really, really powerful question to keep revisiting. If you plant the seed of that question in your mind, you'll get it some immediate answers, but then what'll start to happen is you'll be walking in the park 3 days from now, and this other thing when you were 12 years old is going to pop into your mind, and then you'll be doing something else. You'll be washing dishes a week from now, and this other thing, and it'll start to give you clues. You know, the work that I do and the assessment that we have will give you like sort of like deeper insight in terms of like the deeper impulse, but very often the what did I do that made me lose time thing gives you like the granular expressions that become the red thread that allows you to start to track it back to something deeper as well.
Perfect ending to this wonderful conversation. Thank you both for your time, for your gifts, for your Sparcotypes, for your fascinations, for your impulses, for your love, for your decades of pursuit of supporting millions of people. It's been, I love both of you, and I can't wait for everyone to hear this and watch this.
Thank you, Gio, and Jonathan,
thank you,
and everybody else.
Thanks, everybody. So appreciate it.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
With your superpowers out in the open, it's time for you to reveal your true identity. For deep inside of you is your true self waiting to escape. Peter Parker was Spider-Man, Bruce Banner had the Hulk, and you too, my hero friend, have a secret identity, one which you yourself have not yet seen. Are you prepared to let it out? To finally win the war between you and your inner hero? See you next time, as our next set of guides will show you how to reveal your true identity.